Hi, this is Mark Luke Carrier welcoming you once again to another episode of Fakes, Frauds, and Phonies. John Myatt led a quiet life with his wife and 2 kids in the English village of Sugnell. Although fame as a painter had eluded him, he was known to his neighbors as the chap who wrote that song. Myatt had penned the pop song Silly Games, which, recorded by UK reggae singer Janet Kay, made a good showing on the British Top 40 chart in 1979. Perhaps Myatt's future victims felt the lyrics had been just for them. They go, every time I hear your name, oh, the pain. Boy, how it hurts me inside. Increasingly meager royalties for the one-shot deal hit were not nearly enough to support a family, so Myatt resorted to teaching art to children throughout his county, a job he grew to hate for keeping him away from his own easel. After his wife abandoned him and the kids, Myatt was even more determined to find a source of income that would leave him time for both painting and raising his children. He stumbled on what he felt was an ideal solution. A friend of Myatt's had commissioned him to produce a painting in the style of Drewe. There was no dissimulation or dishonesty here. The man was simply a fan of the French post-impressionist painter, and he paid Myatt £300 to create an emulation of an original he simply could not afford to buy. He was so pleased with his ersatz Drewe that he often told Myatt it would fool the experts. This led Myatt to feel that he could make a reasonable living producing copies, but still strictly within the bounds of the law. The deliberate intention to deceive had yet to cross his mind. He would offer an honest service in exchange for a fair price. To this end, Myatt took out an ad in the UK's popular satirical magazine Private Eye, in which he proposed to make 19th and 20th century genuine fakes for £200. Then, one fateful day, Myatt got a phone call from an enigmatic character called John Drewe, and the incredible adventure began. Much in the manner of the hoary, Drewe was something of a fabulist, and the elements of his portrait are bits and pieces of facts and fiction taken from his own admissions and observations by people who knew him, or thought they knew him. First, his real name was John Cockett, which he changed to John Drewe at the age of 17 for reasons that remain unclear, unless the original name caused merciless teasing in school. His high school friends describe a young man from a lower-middle-class Sussex home who had an overactive imagination. Drewe, or Cockett, bragged of being a direct descendant of the Earl of York and the son of the founder of a chain of department stores. He was odd, keeping well-organized files and carefully classified books in his room as if accumulating data for some later purpose. In later years, under investigation by Scotland Yard, his life revealed a 15-year gap of total mystery. Most citizens of industrialized societies leave a paper trail of some sort: income tax returns, employment and medical records, membership and subscriptions. But investigators drew a complete blank from the age of 17, when Cockett became Drewe, to the age of 32. It was as if Drewe had fallen off the planet for 15 years. There's no record of him leaving Britain, or returning, or doing anything at all. So what did Drewe do for all those years? We can only go by what he tells us, and that much should be taken with a very large grain of salt. The adventures he recounts include joining the Paris student protests in 1968. Later, he says, he studied physics at Kiel University in Germany, followed by a stint teaching experimental physics at the University of Sussex for a year. He then obtained a second PhD in physics from the State University of New York at Buffalo. But none of these institutions have ever heard of either Drewe or Cockett. In 1980, he met a woman who would eventually become his common-law wife. He courted her with lavish expenditures, driving her around in a Rolls-Royce and showering her with expensive gifts and enormous bouquets of flowers. He told her he was a consultant to the Atomic Energy Authority and a member of the board of British Aerospace. None of it was true, and the source of income also remains a mystery. He later told her that he'd held a position with the Ministry of Defense, which he left for a job with a munitions manufacturer. The woman with whom he would eventually have 2 children, never showed any curiosity about her husband's work and never inquired about his job. He left every morning, ostensibly for the Ministry of Defense or the munitions factory, brought home a decent paycheck, and that was good enough for her. This much is known for certain. Drewe spent a few years teaching physics in an exclusive Jewish private school, which he left under a cloud of suspicion. Drewe and his common-law wife apparently lived at arm's length, neither one terribly interested in what the other did for a living. But one fine day, Drewe began showing up at the house with paintings. Lots of paintings. He explained that they were parts of a private collection and that he'd offered to help liquidate them in exchange for a commission on the selling price. The truth was that he had seen Myatt's ad in Private Eye, and introducing himself as Professor Drewe, he explained that he needed several paintings to hang on the walls of his vast new home. It started with a Matisse, then a Klee, and many more orders followed. Myatt would deliver the paintings to Drewe at London's Euston Station. They would have a pint together in the local pub, and as a friendship flourished, Myatt slowly began confiding in his new client. His life was a mess, he readily admitted. He was the single parent of 2 growing children, their mother gone God knew where with God knew whom, and no matter how much money his Private Eye ad brought in, everyday expenses and the rent gobbled it all up. Drewe tried to cheer him up, and in time felt close enough to him to invite him to his home. Myatt was astonished of the luxury of his new friend's home, the Mercedes in the driveway, the bespoke suits, and an existence that seemed to say that price was no object. Drewe also impressed Myatt by explaining that his job at the Ministry of Defense was just a cover, as he was really an operative for British intelligence, which he confirmed by opening his expensive jacket to display 2 handguns tucked away in shoulder holsters. This was light years away from Myatt's dreary life in a sleepy provincial town. He found it exciting to hang around with Drewe, later admitting in court that Drewe's lifestyle and manner were hypnotizing. During one of their pub conversations, Drewe asked Myatt what style he most admired. Cubist, answered Myatt, without hesitation. Good, said Drewe. Then paint me a Braque. No sooner said than done. Myatt delivered a fine-looking example. Not long after, Drewe explained that he'd taken it to Christie's and fooled the experts, who not for a minute doubted the authenticity of the work and said it was worth the equivalent of $38,000. It was at this point that Myatt's career in crime began. It's interesting to note that Myatt's deception was strictly superficial and stylistic. We saw earlier how Van Meegeren went to great lengths and expense replicating 17th century pigments, or how Hepburn used old paper and a clever aging process to fool scientific inquiry. Myatt never made the slightest effort in that direction. Quite the contrary. He worked with plain, domestic emulsion paint and added KY jelly to quicken the drying process. Of course, Myatt never faked old masters, but nonetheless, the products he used were post-1960s, easily revealed by basic testing. The timing was great for the new partnership in crime. The art market was going wild in the mid-1980s, with paintings of every description selling for record prices. Myatt took a few precautions. He was sloppy, even by his own admission. The whirlwind of a crazy market carried off everything he made. He was cranking it out at an industrial rate, creating an unending stream of Sutherlands, Giacomettis, Nicholsons, Matisses, his proprietary quick-dry mixture of lubricant jelly and emulsions, allowing him to paint as fast as he could. It's likely he suspected this adventure would end in tragedy. For the time being, however, he enjoyed the fruits of his illicit labor, and Drewe never failed to stroke his ego to keep him at his easel. But Myatt's skill at forgery was not the only secret of their success. I've mentioned that among the hurdles encountered in selling a forgery is creating a credible provenance. Some crooks, as we've seen, create anonymous, unverifiable provenances, the perennial furtive Russian prince selling off his collection, and so on, while others go to the adventure novel route with long stories of looted art, firebombed museums, and Napoleon snatching the paintings from the flames. Drewe chose to perfect a technique that had been innovated by Drewe and Lessard. Those two, to create a credible provenance, scoured libraries and secondhand bookstores for art albums with folio inserts. Before four-color offset printing made polychrome reproduction affordable, publishers produced an artist album with the text in standard black and white printing and hand-pasted color inserts of the art on designated blank pages. Drewe and Lessard would carefully remove these and replace them with a reproduction of a similar work by the Houri. If they had a sucker on the line for a Matisse, they'd open the album and say, "There you go. Page 56, illustration 29, a Matisse original, which, as you can see, once belonged to the Hermitage Museum." Little did the victim know they were examining a Matisse by the Houri, simply glued into the book to bolster the deception. Drewe took this technique to a much higher level of sophistication. First, Drewe would try to find living provenances, paying friends and relatives to pose as the previous owners of any given forgery by Myatt. When he would not find volunteers, and as the previous owners grew wary, he began breaking into the archives of prestigious museums and institutions like the Institute of Contemporary Art, the Tate, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. He posed as a scholar doing research, adding considerably to his credibility by making £20,000 in donations to selected museums. In these institutions, he would plant a history of Myatt's forgeries in the proper documentation so that a careful buyer who requested verification on provenance would find the work catalogued as a legitimate piece. Brilliant. Drewe went to incredible lengths to carry out this duplicity. He once penetrated the archives of London's National Art Library, and wielding a surgeon's scalpel, he proceeded to cut up a 1955 catalogue for a London gallery show. Then, using identical typeface generated by his home computer, he tampered with the text to include forged works by Myatt. Once this work of complicated substitutions was completed, he patiently restitched the lining and replaced the book in the archives. Thus did Drewe give Myatt's forgeries rock-solid institutional pedigrees. And that's just what we know, perhaps only the tip of the iceberg. Drewe was so successful in penetrating the files of prestigious British museums, so successful in taking on the identity of a bona fide researcher, that to this day, provenance research in London is tainted. One must be doubly careful in verifying documents, certificates of authenticity, catalogs, publications, for fear that Drewe tampered with them. We may never know how much harm he did. In an article by Peter Landsman in the Ottawa Citizen of August 3, 1999, Museum of Modern Art Director Glenn Lowry was quoted as saying, "It is one of the most extensive frauds in the visual arts. What distinguishes this case is how methodical Drewe was, and how well he understood the process of validation. His manipulation of the system is as interesting and troubling as the forgeries themselves." Close quotes. But soon enough, things began to unravel. In the mid-1990s, Drewe accompanied Myatt to a Christie's auction, where he watched as one of his Dubuffets sold for a huge sum. Instead of feeling elated, Myatt found himself depressed by the event. It should have been his painting up there fetching high prices, he thought. He yearned to return to painting in the style of John Myatt, instead of Dubuffet, Giacometti, Modigliani, or any of the famous artists he forged so successfully. He was also growing very wary of Drewe, if not downright afraid of him. In Myatt's own terms, Drewe was possessed of a spooky charisma, oddly enticing at first, but increasingly malevolent with time. The flashing of handguns, which Myatt had once found exciting, was getting to be disconcerting. Myatt even perceived an unspoken threat that they were in this together, Drewe seemed to imply, and there was no backing off now. Drewe's mad behavior so unhinged Myatt that even a simple telephone conversation required a stiff drink to settle his nerves. But despite Myatt's misgivings and pangs of conscience, it was an acrimonious breakup with Drewe's common-law wife that set the pair on this slippery slope. Having kicked her husband out of the house and long suspecting he was involved in illicit activities, she discovered all sorts of incriminating paperwork. She promptly turned the documents over to the police and, seeing an opportunity to make some quick money, began blackmailing Drewe and Myatt. Drewe was livid. He told Myatt he would set fire to his ex-wife's home and destroy the evidence. Myatt didn't take him seriously. He should have known better. The house did indeed burn down. An upstairs tenant, jumping from a third-floor window to escape the flames, was seriously hurt and later died of her injuries. Drewe, the prime suspect in what was soon uncovered as a criminally set fire, was quickly arrested. But the police could not make the charges stick and released him within days. Things continued to unravel for Drewe and Myatt as the expert began wondering about the works they were being offered. Notable among them was Peter Naum, senior director and head of Sotheby's British Paintings Department for almost 20 years, now owner of London's Leicester Galleries and a contributor to BBC's hit program Antiques Roadshow. Impressed by the documentary supporting Christie's previous confirmations, Nahum was persuaded to buy 2 paintings by Myatt through Drewe's intermediaries. In a Guardian daily article titled Fakes Leave Art World in Chaos, February 3, 1999, Nahum said, quote, "Art dealers spend all day sifting through fakes. It's part of the job. I think probably about 30% of what dealers look at are not what they should be in one way or another. The auction rooms do sell a lot of them, partly out of negligence, partly because it's impossible to know everything." Close quotes. According to Dick Ellis, then the head of the London Art and Antiquities Unit of the Metropolitan Police, Peter Nahum was the first art professional to go to the police. In the Guardian daily article, Nahum adds, quote, "Drewe is a highly intelligent man, but he is a criminal. If a highly intelligent person sits down and uses all his brain power for years to try to fool you, putting everything in place, documents, manuscripts, everything, you'll be fooled. We are all vulnerable to that." Close quotes. Meanwhile, given probable cause by the documents handed over by Drewe's ex-wife, the police raided Myatt's home. He offered no resistance and quickly sat down to a full confession. Myatt had had enough, preferring a jail sentence to any further contact with Drewe, a man he now considered to be a certifiable lunatic. He felt a great weight lifted from his shoulders, he later explained, as he spilled the beans right down to the last detail, telling the police how many forgeries he'd painted and where they'd been sold. The inspector on the case, Jonathan Cyril, was a colorful character in his own right. Before coming to Scotland Yard, he'd been a painter, a restorer, and an art historian. In fact, Cyril had all the skills of a good forger. He just happened to fall on the right side of the law. He soon found that Myatt did not have the stuff of a true criminal. At first, the quick money had been quite welcome, but as time passed, the complex deceptions became too much, not to mention the difficulties of dealing with a man like Drewe. Drewe remained a fantasist to the end. He was arrested and charged with conspiracy to defraud and forgery, but even after 4 days of intense interrogations, he refused to admit guilt. The paintings, he told police, were all genuine, and Myatt was just a fellow he'd hired to do some restorations. Released on bail, he promptly disappeared. His eventual recapture was like a scene from a bad film. The police simply followed his devoted mother to his hiding place and he was taken back into custody. Drewe's last days of freedom hiding from the police appeared to have been propitious to his active imagination. He dumped his previous story and decided to come clean with another wild fantasy. After his recapture, police investigators listened with incredulity, perhaps some amusement as he told of a vast conspiracy, explaining that he was the unwilling fall guy in a secret international cabal that included co-conspirators like the Metropolitan Police, the Ministry of Defense, and no more than a half a dozen nations. He amended Myatt's confession of having painted 200 forgeries by claiming that he'd produced at least 4,000, the proceeds of the sales being used to finance covert arms deals for Iran, Iraq, and Sierra Leone. In this version of the story, Myatt, quiet, unassuming Myatt, the man who was nervous at the very thought that Drewe owned a gun, was not just an artist, but also the head of a nefarious underground movement of bloodthirsty neo-Nazis. Oh well. And the 15-year gap in his life. Drewe explained that he'd spent those years working for British intelligence, developing high-performance ballistic missile systems. He constantly assured journalists and the police that he could corroborate every one of his claims. He never did. Are you surprised? Drewe's trial lasted 6 months, and he clung to these fantasies to the bitter end, standing in his own defense and regaling the jury with stories of counter-espionage, arms dealing, and a corrupt art world that was out to get him. They were entertained, but unconvinced. The guilty verdict came after 5.5 hours of deliberation. From the bench, presiding judge Jeffrey Rivlin said that Drewe had an extraordinary talent in manipulating vulnerable people and sentenced him to 6 years in jail. The judge recognized the mitigating circumstances in Myatt's case, but the crime was nonetheless of such magnitude that he would not escape a custodial sentence. He got 12 months. Myatt started a website transporting his private eye offer of genuine fakes to the wider market of the Internet. Later, he hosted a television series featuring his ability to reproduce the works of famous artists. And whatever happened to Drewe? It was widely reported several years ago that actor Michael Douglas had paid $1 million for the rights to Drewe's story, but the latter would have none of it. Living in suburban London after serving 3 years of his 6-year sentence, he was quoted in the November 28, 2000 edition of the National Post. Douglas is making a film that will portray me as some sort of criminal mastermind when the truth is much more complicated. He's using information provided by my ex-wife and former business partner. I will not talk to his people. Last time they called, I told them to bugger off. Close quotes. The latest news on Drewe is that he served 8 years in jail after being found guilty of defrauding an elderly woman of her life savings. That's it for the two Johns, John Drewe and John Myatt. Well, that's it for this episode of Fakes, Frauds, and Phonies. Please subscribe, and if you're a victim of art fraud, please write to me. My email is fakesandfrauds, all in one word, at writeme, WRITEME.com. In closing, please note that a illustrated print version of Fakes, Frauds, and Phonies is available at Amazon worldwide in Kindle or paperback format. So this is your host, Mark Luke Carrier, saying bye-bye for now.